Why? What would be your main case for giving us a written constitution? Because one of the quotes that forever stuck with me from my A level politics was that America is thrashing around in an 18th century straitjacket with regards to their constitution. That they're stuck because of the very solid and codified nature of it, that they have been unable to adapt their institutions and conventions rapidly enough to deal with the way the world has changed over the past 250 years. And one of the advantages that we frequently wrote about and discussed was that Britain, in their uncodified, sort of very loose, I don't even know if you could call it a constitution as such, but our sort of arrangement of conventions and institutions that makes up the way that we run our democracy, is the flexibility of it is one of the virtues of it and one of the real advantages of it. Like, why would you say that's not the case?
Well, I think one of the flexibility, of course, can be a weakness, and we saw this in relation to Boris Johnson's plans to close down Parliament. And in a written constitution, for instance, you could make it very clear that the Prime Minister did not have the power to do that. Other things that could be made clear in a written constitution is, for instance, that the UK would not seek to break international law. There are the other sort of aspects of a written constitution that could be included would be to sort of lock in the rights that Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland have as separate nations within the United Kingdom. What we currently have, I think, as you pointed out, is a sort of hodgepodge of different laws, precedents, established practice, which means that it's very hard to know precisely where on different issues we stand. Now, obviously, I suspect that if we were to introduce a written constitution, it would be substantially more detailed than the US, for instance, and would be more modern, if I can put it that way, in terms of its content. But I think the final thing I would say about it, and this is critical to what Unlocked Democracy is trying to secure, is that this written constitution is something that would be arrived at through a citizens' assembly process. So in other words, it wouldn't be politicians who are writing it or drafting it. It would be in effect, the equivalent of 12 people from the Clapham Omnibus who sit on a jury. There would be 200 people chosen at random, but to be representative of the United Kingdom, who would sit on a body that would work out what we wanted to include in our constitution. Because, we could have a limited constitution, or, for instance, we could have one that said that people were entitled to access to food and housing. Some countries have that in their constitutions, we don't.
Mm. Now, the citizens' assembly idea is one that I've come across kind of more and more over the past few years. I first came across it when I did an interview with Jamie Pow, who's the editor of Northern Slant. It's like just a news and commentary outlet in Northern Ireland. And he had done some research on the effectiveness of it and how it would function, and just sort of scoped out the idea. But then sort of over the last year or two, I've heard more and more and more about it. One of the highest profile examples is Extinction Rebellion. Actually, they're calling for a citizens' assembly in order to deal with climate change. And I really love the idea. Actually, I think that quite often people dismiss ordinary people's ability to genuinely comprehend or understand politics or democracy or concepts like that, when I genuinely think if you sit people down and run them through it and give them a fair look at both sides of an argument, that people can generally be pretty reasonable. But how realistic is it to really see that put into place in the UK? Because again, I've seen it from a lot of I don't know if you call them fringe groups, but groups that are maybe outside the very mainstream of British politics. How likely do you think it would be to be able to get that kind of assembly put together in the UK? And what do you think it would require for people to actually accept that as a potential idea to reform our democracy?
Well, I think the people who would have to accept this as an idea for reforming our democracy would probably have to be politicians, because I think the desire for it is there. amongst the public, and we've seen that around the world. For instance, so in France, the Climate Assembly that they established, we've had our own equivalent in terms of 6 select committees of the UK Parliament to establish a climate climate panel to discuss climate issues. There are a number of local authorities that have done this on a much smaller scale. So close to where I live, Kingston Council, for instance, put together a citizens' assembly to look at the issue of air quality. So this is happening more and more. And what it does, I think, successfully is re-establish people's interest in decision-making processes and gives them a bit of trust back in terms of they can be part of that decision-making process and arrive at decisions that are then acted on. And I guess that is the critical part, because there's not much point having a citizens' assembly at the end of which the politicians say, well, thank you, that was a very interesting exercise, and now we're going to go off and do something different, because that that immediately demolishes the purpose of it. But I agree with the point that you make, that there might be concern that perhaps if matters were left in the hands of a citizens' assembly, that the solutions that came forward might be weird and wonderful. But in practice, that isn't the output from the citizens' assemblies that we've seen. And it was interesting that during the Brexit period, there was a sort of citizens' assembly that was set up to look at the issue of immigration, one of the hottest topics of the Brexit campaigning. And this was a representative sample, so more people who supported Brexit, the 52-48 ratio in this group. And they actually came up with some pretty, I would say, a pretty liberal position on the issue of immigration, because once they had the experts presenting the pros and cons, they'd listened to the evidence, they then came to the conclusion that actually for the UK, a slightly more flexible approach to immigration was a better approach. So I don't have concerns that citizens' assemblies would come up with weird and wonderful ideas that would be impossible for anyone to implement.
Well, I think there's that famous quote that's like often attributed to Churchill, but I don't think there's any evidence that he actually said it. There's nothing written down. I tried to find it once, but that like the worst or the best argument against democracy was a 5-minute conversation with your average voter. Which I love. I love the quote, but yeah, there's no proof it was actually Churchill. But I'm interested about that Kingston air pollution citizens assembly. I wasn't aware of this case. What were the conclusions that came out of that? Was it like a physical policy, like implementations that came out of that? Was it like a physical something?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, so it was an event organised by Involve, who are the people who organise these types of events, and they took a representative sample. I think it was quite a small sample. I think it was about 30 people from different parts of Kingston, different backgrounds, different sort of ethnic origins and so on, gender balanced, and they looked at the issue of air quality and some of the recommendations they came forward with. So this, I think, reported at the beginning of this year, were things like making sure that tough measures were taken around schools to reduce the impact of air pollution on children as they're going to school, to push hard on rollout of electric vehicles, and a number of quite sensible invest in public transport, all the things you'd expect. Now that then went to the relevant committee on Kingston Council. I must say at that point, I'm not sure I don't know what the outcome of that was, but clearly that was an exercise that the participants thought was of value and came up with some sensible solutions. So I hope that the committee took those on board.
Okay, I'll
And I
definitely
think
look into
just
that.
the final thing I'd say, of course, is that for politicians, what this can do is then to some extent provide protection in that a group of independent people not politically aligned, have come up with some solutions that then politicians implement. It's convenient, frankly, for politicians to be able to say, well, actually, it wasn't us that came up with these ideas. The people who came up with these ideas were people like you, and this is what they've recommended.
Thanks so much for listening. If you haven't already and you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to this podcast and to our mailing list. And don't forget, my book, Brexit, The Establishment Civil War, is now available for pre-order on Amazon. You'll find the link in the description below. Until next time, thanks so much for listening.